técnico, pero nada grave, ya se resolvieron. Tenemos el gran agrado y la suerte de tener acá por algunos días el profesor Lawrence Taylor y la artista Maeve Hickey, y estamos muy contentos de poder escuchar de sus propias palabras un trabajo que hicieron sobre peregrinajes. Para decirle antes de empezar quiero decir algunas palabras sobre ella y su trayectoria como profesionales. Larry es profesor de Antropología a la National University of Ireland en Maynooth, en Irlanda, y estuvo por mucho tiempo jefe de departamento y ahora trabaja como Senior Advisor al presidente por los afares internacionales. Así que tiene un cargo muy especial. Trabajó durante mucho tiempo sobre temáticas de inmigración, fronteras, religión, con interés especial sobre los peregrinajes y siempre en conexión con pueblos indígenas, que sea de Irlanda, de Estados Unidos, especialmente con el pueblo indígena de Estados Unidos que viajan hacia la frontera de México. Entonces es una frontera, él se ocupa mucho de fronteras de personas que viajan de un lado al otro y viajan cambiando su identidad mientras que lo hacen. Bueno, Maeve es una artista, una fotógrafa que trabaja con muchos medios. Tiene un trabajo realmente interesante bajo muchos puntos de vista, y colaboró con varios académicos y antropólogos. Entre los otros colaboró con Larry fotografiando los inmigrantes o los peregrinos, y uno de estos trabajos en el cual colaboraron lo vamos a ver hoy día en su charla de hoy, que se llama Pilgrimage to the Edge, que podemos traducir como peregrinaje hacia la frontera o hacia el extremo, hacia el Finisterre. ¿Cómo se pronuncia Lochder? Lochder. Okay. No soy indígena de Irlanda, así que como Maeve, ella no puede explicar la pronuncia mucho mejor. Lochder en la geografía moral de Europa y Irlanda. Bienvenidos y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a ustedes, y lo siento que vamos a presentar en inglés porque mi nivel, hablando de mí, no es suficiente para presentar algo académico en español. Tengo el español de las calles de México, es todo lo que tengo, hablando con chamacos en la calle. Y también este papel es un poco complejo, es más en diálogo entre Maeve y yo. A ver, entonces no es típico de papeles académicos. Él es la gente auténtica, y yo en este diálogo estoy antropólogo. A ver, y también hay sus fotos después. Entonces, en inglés ahora, I begin. Sin eso. This is from the year 1353, a letter to the Bishop of Clogher from the Augustinian prior, the head of this pilgrimage site in the northwest of Ireland, in reference to Chrysophon, a Hungarian knight who had traveled all the way from Hungary to the edge of Ireland on this pilgrimage. For having confessed, we gave him absolution by the authority of St. Patrick and our order, and thus absolved, we permitted him to enter the pit by which descent is made into the purgatory. and thus we send him to you, who has already seen purgatory and many marvels. And it's signed, The Ends of the Earth, 1353.
Arriving, summer 2010. I caught the last boat from Pettigo, sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning. I signed in and bought a ticket before boarding, as you would for any excursion, but I felt the seriousness of what I was doing as soon as I found a place on the boat. There were only about 4 of us, and everyone was silent and locked into his own thoughts. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. I just sat silently on the boat. There was a certain feeling of dread on my part. As for the others, it seemed as though it was for them something difficult, not joyous, not jovial.
So begins the artist's account of her pilgrimage to Station Island on Lough Derg, a lake in County Donegal in the northwest corner of Ireland, an end of the earth that figured prominently. There's Ireland, and there's Lough Derg. A lake, an end of the earth that figured importantly in the moral geography of late medieval Europe, and in more recent times in the changing moral geography of Ireland. According to legend, on this small island, St. Patrick encountered purgatory in a cave in the 5th century, and the faithful and forlorn have been coming for penance and absolution ever since. As for the artist, over here, she had come to photograph place and pilgrims, but needed to be one herself first, and so took the lonely road across Ireland and then boarded the last of the ferries that daily bring the few dozen hardy souls to pass 48 hours in painful, prayerful devotion. They will go one night without sleep and 2 days without food, beyond a few cups of black tea and dry toast, and the whole time on the island without shoes, to trod barefoot the stony, typically cold, damp earth on the, quote, beds, doing the prescribed stations, as popular Irish Catholicism describes the act of rounding the sacred sites while reciting Hail Marys and other standard prayers, a powerful interaction of place, body, and language. In their schemata of pilgrimage types, Victor and Edith Turner they wrote about Lough Derg and categorized it as archaic. And while I am not disputing their designation, it may imply a misleadingly static history, the word archaic does. And I want to suggest another broad category into which it fits: pilgrimages to the edge rather than to a center, an opposition that can be dynamic rather than static. This form of sacred journey has its own history in the Judeo-Christian tradition, beginning with the Old Testament movement away from Egypt into the desert, a defining journey that in that case created a nation and a moral geography, although contested in our own time. Indeed, the elaboration of a moral geography, by which I mean the ascription of moral values as well as symbolic meaning to landscapes, in order to use them in projects of collective self-definition. That was central to the Hebrew enterprise and provided a model that resonates and repeats through Western history, taking material form on the landscape as meaningful movement, for example, the Exodus of the Old Testament and its reenactment in the 20th century, or of blocking movement by walling or fencing at the edges of empires, cities, neighborhoods, even housing estates, separating the moral order within from the implied or real dangers and moral chaos on the outside. Pilgrimage can be understood as a particularly powerful form of movement in this typology, an exercise of moral geography defining sacred self, passage, and site, sites at the center or sites at the dangerous but powerful edge. The biblical Edgewood journey was into a wilderness, a frightening landscape in which deity manifested itself in awesomely direct ways. Such pilgrimage could also be made by lone individuals who sought God in holy, wild places. Once again, the Old Testament supplies the Western model. Prophets in the desert, followed in the New Testament by John the Baptist, and of course Christ himself. In the ensuing Christian era, this motif is continued in the Eremitic tradition of lone monks or small communities finding a place typically in the desert, but always in extremis, someplace way out. The Irish landscape is still littered with the remains of just this kind of movement, of monk cells clinging to cliffs on wind-battered seacoasts or secreted on islands in the sea or remote lakes, as in the case of Loch Derg. Such ruins are often still animated by stories of the early saints, their wanderings, mishaps, and miracles, and by devotional practices known by the Irish word turas, which is often translated as pilgrimage, but is typically rendered more descriptively in English as simply doing the stations, going to these places and praying. Thus, the ancient movement to the edge by the saintly monk is repeated by folk seeking the still holy spot associated with his or her residence and movements. There is very often a holy well at such sites, whose miraculous origin and curing powers are likely explained in the story of the associated saint who was there. The stories of St. Patrick are not different in type from those of the other early saints. He too wandered the landscape and came to be associated with particular powerful places. And nowhere is that sense of saints' movement mirrored by modern pilgrims stronger than in two places. One on Croagh Patrick, a mountain in Mayo, on whose top Patrick is said to have passed what I would describe as a mosaic 40 days and nights, and up whose slippery flanks many thousands ascend annually. It's a big annual pilgrimage. Loch Derg, however, is very much another story, as there are neither folk legends nor any firm evidence of the 5th century saint, patron saint of Ireland's, having ever been there, much less of his encounter with purgatory. There are, however, indications that the place has long figured in the sacred landscape of Ireland, subject to the usual series of religious regimes. While Patrick was among the early medieval pantheon of local Irish saints, he shared the landscape with a good few others, who had place name and other associations with Loch Derg, and who may well have been the objects of pilgrimage to the island, only to be replaced with St. Patrick by the Augustinian canons into whose care the site fell in the 12th century, and who, with the help of medieval chroniclers, put this obscure corner of Ireland on the mental map of Europe. And from then on, you have these stories of knights and others coming from all over Europe to this edge on pilgrimage, usually for such good reasons as patricide, because you'd want to have a big sin to have to go that far to absolve it. The pilgrimage that developed from the 12th century under the direction of the Augustinians was a distinctly European business, at least as described by the various English, French, Italian, and Hungarian knights who made that strikingly penitential journey from the 12th through the 15th centuries. As historian Le Goff explains at length, the site played a crucial role in what might be called the geographical aspect of the general transformation of the Church in the 11th and 12th centuries. The combined efforts of Vatican and orders like the Cistercians were not only reforming religious belief and practice, but forming, I would say, a moral geography of Christendom at the same time, with the Vatican at the center. New and newly invigorated pilgrimage routes took people to powerful places like Compostela, of course, and or Rome, or the Holy Land. But the really imaginative move in all this was to locate an edge, not just of Christendom, but between this world and the next, projecting the vertical layering of worlds onto the horizontal map of this one. Thus was thought the most liminal spot on Earth to be the border between Earth and the next world. While Mount Etna contended for the honor in Sicily, the allure of the less fiery Irish island, in that regard, the volcano might have been more like hell than purgatory. This Irish island was being promoted by the Augustinians and seemed a better candidate. For the medieval imagination, it seems that it could have been no more appropriate setting for the entrance into the demonic liminal space of purgatory, that Christian version of the cave in which Odysseus encountered the shade of Achilles, than this dark island on a red lake, which is what Loch Durrach means, in the distant, obscure, and hence fantastic landscape of Ultima Thule, or Ireland. Ireland as a whole was in the process of becoming more European in those years, before and after the Anglo-Norman incursions, through the direct and indirect presence of continental religious orders and ideas. The See of Armagh, under the 12th century bishop St. Malachy, became a center of reform, and he's the one who controlled Loch Durrach. While that reform was principally focused on the clergy, a connection with popular devotion was made in the case of St. Patrick's Purgatory, where what was very probably a local edge, a wild spot made holy by the actions of an early saint, could be appropriated by a European audience as an edge in this larger sense, an edge between this world and the next. For the penitents from the continent, from Hungary, Germany, and all over, this journey to the edge of the world was an encounter with the very purgatory being promoted by the church on the continent. That is, they started to preach about purgatory, and now you could actually go there. As much as the Augustinians and other continental orders might have pulled Ireland into their evolving moral geography of Europe, it might be said that Ireland was already an edge even to itself, and full of holy, powerful, remote places, as well as a tradition of visions of other worlds encountered in these places. For the contemporary Irish, we only know that they too visited the site, and in so doing were likely continuing a practice that long antedated any particular association with Patrick or with purgatory. In any case, it's clear by the time of the closing of the purported gateway to the island at the end of the 15th century, that there had been a considerable flow of pilgrims from the surrounding region, from all over Ireland as well. From their perspective, this was no doubt another powerful point of sacred geography, where penance could be exchanged for cures or an improved afterlife by trudging around the holy ruins or natural features, and in this case, descending into this wondrous cave. That's not to say that Patrick was on the same footing as any other Irish saint by then. His prominence as legendary converter of the Irish was appropriated by the Augustinians, not only in the form of the purgatory, but in the location of his alleged grave. Very conveniently, the Augustinians claim to have found the bodies of St. Patrick, Bridget, and Columkill, the three main Irish saints. It's nice that they turned up that way, conveniently close to their headquarters in Armagh. And it was clearly the intention of that religious order to capture the potentially powerful cult of those saints and to promote them over any local saints. While the attempt to make down Patrick, where the bodies were a major pilgrimage site, met with small success, the growth of the cult of Patrick across Ireland in late medieval times owes much to his promotion by these religious orders. He is in these centuries represented not only as the classic Irish wandering saint, performing miracles and curses as he moved over the landscape, but as the patron and protector